This video will demonstrate concrete polishing. This floor has already been polished, but has lost some of its clarity. It's in good shape and there's no damage. The beginning of the process starts with a 100 grit terrazzo pad. This is a copper pad. Normally it's used as a transitional diamond, but here it's being used to start the process. Water is being used, and they're being run on a 6-tool propane rotary. The intent here is to place a new scratch in the surface so that any of the previous polishing that had taken place has obviously been undone, and a new scratch starts a new surface that will be refined to a polished finish. This is the beginning of that process. Once this step is done, a wetback is used to collect the slurry. The next grit being used is a 200 grit terrazzo copper pad. This would normally be the grit that follows the 100 grit terrazzo copper. It's also a copper-based pad, but a 200 grit. The responsibility of these pads is to remove the scratches that were made by the 100 grit. This follows the principle of polished concrete: progressively finer grits to process the floor to a reflective surface. After the slurry is collected, the floor is washed. An auto scrubber certainly is more productive than washing it with a broom and water, but either method will work. The aim here is to remove the slurry that's dried inside the pores of the concrete. Once dry, densifier is applied to harden the surface. Densifier reacts with calcium hydroxide in the concrete. This is a compound that's in every concrete slab that can be polished. The reaction instigates the growth of crystalline structures between the fine aggregates that are in the concrete. This is how the floor becomes more dense. The next step, after the densifier is reacted, is a 200 grit resin. The step that preceded it was a 200 grit copper. This is a more aggressive scratch. The 200 grit resin is going to be responsible for removing and replacing that more aggressive scratch with a finer one. In this case, it's a 200 grit resin. This is also done wet. The next step is a 400 grit resin. Like the 200, it is a resin-based diamond, and it is being used to remove and replace those 200 grit scratches with that 400 grit scratch. The floor is already starting to show some reflectivity as a result of that 400 grit wet pad. Once the slurry is collected and the surface has been allowed to dry, an 800 grit resin diamond is used. This diamond will remove and replace those 400 grit scratches. The reflection is improving as a result of this step, but also clarity is being produced. Clarity can best be explained as the definition of the objects or the light as they are reflected in the surface of the concrete. And that's about it. A degraded polished surface restored to an 800 grit finish.